Hey friends, welcome back to Checkbox Other. Today's episode, I was like nerding out so much before I hopped on. There were so many levels and layers of this that had me excited. I am so excited because you're going to meet Ryan Greer. Ryan Greer is somebody that I've known since I was like 10 years old. We grew up in Glastonbury, Connecticut together, and we haven't seen each other in years. And so it was a true delight to be able to have this reunion and talk about stuff that we are both like so passionate about and have you guys be flies on the wall with us. And really, I always think about it as you're in conversation with us, even though you're not in conversation with us. So if you have anything that you want to contribute or talk about based on this episode, please feel free to reach out. In this episode, we talk about so many different amazing things that Ryan is up to, but most specifically, the focus of this is talking about white supremacy and domestic terrorism. And really, Ryan is like the go-to person for counterterrorism efforts domestically. So let me give you a little bit of a bio about Ryan, some of his receipts in the professional realm. Aside from him being an incredibly amazing human being, here you go. Here are his receipts. He serves as the National Security Director and Chief of Staff for the ADL, Government Relations, Advocacy, and Community Engagement Team, known as GRACE. Prior to this role, he served as the Director for Program Assessment and Strategy, leading innovative counter-extremism activities for the ADL Programs Division. For those of you who don't know what the ADL is, it's the Anti-Defamation League, and I highly, highly recommend you take a look at all the amazing things that the ADL is all about. We are going to have in the show notes a very specific link to the 7-point plan that Ryan references in the episode, so definitely learn more about the ADL. They're doing amazing things. Ryan also serves as a non-resident fellow for New America's International Security Program and as a security fellow at the Truman National Security Project. In previous roles, Ryan served as the Senior Advisor for Community Partnerships and Terrorism Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He was a Counterterrorism Policy Advisor and Program Officer in the U.S. Department of State and a Special Assistant for the White House National Security Council. No big deal, right? He was also on staff for 2 members of the House of Representatives. So all of those receipts mean that Ryan knows what he's talking about. He's a badass in this space, and I'm so excited that he's here with us today. At the end of this episode, I said to him that he has enough phrases and sayings and amazing nuggets that he has bumper stickers that could fill up an entire back bumper. So I am so excited for you to hear all of the incredible wisdom that he brings to the party here. I am just so grateful that he joined us, and I am so grateful that you're here. So if you have been navigating any dynamics around race in our country, if you have been trying to learn more about or understand white supremacy and how it operates today, rather than the kind of KKK history we learned about that after the civil rights movement, we assumed somehow it was gone, even though what we've experienced in the last 5-6 years is very much so the opposite. Ryan and I talk about that. We talk about how even today, how there are different dynamics that are showing up in so many different nuanced ways than have in the past, and how we can kind of navigate through that, and how we can move forward in a more human, and healing centric fashion. So for anybody that is interested in learning more about this stuff, this episode is all for you. And also, if you want to learn more, I encourage you to go follow Ryan or reach out to me. So go to nikkieannocent.com/join the conversation and let us know what you thought, because there is so much incredible information in this and I want to hear from you. So without further ado, here is my friend, Ryan Greer. Ryan Greer. I can't even say your name by itself. Welcome to Checkbox Other. I am so happy you're here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you. And this is just, I've had a chance to listen to a couple previous episodes, and just, this is such an important podcast. I'm so glad you're doing it, and just really grateful I can be part of it.
All right. I'm going to start like getting chills and tearing up to start. That's not fair. Let's not get there yet. So just so everybody knows, Ryan and I have known each other since we were 10, 11.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That. Since before we were who we are today. Yeah, very
before
early.
We were adults, if we call ourselves that these days. We kind of have to by age. But I am, just for you all to know, I'm like nerding out really hard. I know that I get excited for all my episodes, but like this one, just you're going to want to hear this whole thing. So, right. The first thing that I normally give people the floor first to give a Cliff Notes version of their lives, the twists, the turns, the aha moments, the pivots, all the things that they feel like have led them to where they are today that are kind of relevant to this conversation, or anything that you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, again, thank you for the opportunity. And let's go back to the beginning and where we started in, middle school, back when you and I first got to know each other. I think that a couple of the twists and turns in my life, I had to, unfortunately, confronting mortality at a young age and just experiencing some death, and just at a sort of unusually young age, sort of having this kind of broader spiritual question of kind of what's my place in the world. And as we'll talk about, I assume throughout our chat here today, I came from a place of privilege, and so I wanted to sort of do something bigger than myself, and I knew that at a young age. Whether it was really young, I sponsored every whale and every wolf that you can sponsor as a kid, and that sort of was in 2 community service clubs in high school. And I didn't really know how I wanted to serve. I just knew I wanted to do something kind of on a larger level. And then 9/11 happened, and it shook the world, and it shook our community, and as many communities. And friends were headed off to war, and it was just this, I was coming of age at the same time that the country was coming of age in its new era.
Mhm.
And I had this kind of strange feeling of processing all of that, as feeling like I hated the Iraq War, I hated the Patriot Act. I was very sort of opposed. I felt that that was the wrong tool, but also the wrong tool to address some challenges and threats and tragedies in the world that did need addressing. And so I felt like I sort of ended up ascribing to a kind of political community where people would say, well, the Patriot Act was terrible, Iraq War was terrible, and then I'd say, okay, so what should we do about this Al Qaeda thing? And they'd say, well, I'm going to go into healthcare politics. And I sort of said, that doesn't sound like we're solving the problem. So I said, is there a way that we can kind of address these issues and honestly and in a humane and civil rights comporting way? And so that thinking of mine kind of evolved between late high school and early post college, and I found myself getting a master's in public policy, which is kind of a generalist public policy degree, kind of like the MBA for policy world. And
Mhm.
I just kept gravitating back toward this question of what should we do about terrorism that's not dropping bombs and creating the next generation of terrorists as we're doing it. And so that led me to kind of the terrorism prevention model and counterterrorism as it exists outside of the more kind of kinetic and coercive elements. Not to say that there's never a time and place for those types of things, but just I kind of gravitated towards the more preventive community building focus. And so I had the opportunity to then work at the U.S. Department of State on countering ISIS, and it was kind of dream come true. I got to help write the playbook for addressing a terrorist threat, and be part of that kind of sitting in the White House Situation Room saying, what should we do about this new terrorist threat? It felt like me as a senior in high school thinking about what I want to do with my life. I was like, I want to rethink how we think about counterterrorism threats. And then I got to be asked those questions right
Yeah.
after grad school. And it was just so rewarding. And I just dove into it and became passionate about it. And then, as time went on and I sort of was looking for a different challenge because a lot of people gravitated toward the counter ISIS threat. It became kind of bureaucratized as it should have, but it was more exciting for me in an entrepreneurial sense. And then I sort of said, well, what's another challenge that's like this? And at the same time that ISIS's influence started to wane, the white supremacists and anti-government extremist threat within our homeland started to rise. And I sort of saw so many of the parallels. And I had a
Mm.
former boss who basically said to me, hey, can you take the kind of tools and concepts we worked on in counter ISIS and bring it to ADL and work on countering white supremacy? And it just felt like fate. And it felt like kind of a coming home in a sense of seeing all of the sort of politics that originally motivated my direction sort of become part of the polarizing influence that would lead to our own extremist threat. And so I've been at ADL for about a little over 4 years and really focused on countering domestic terrorism and how do we do it in a way that does not become the next Patriot Act, the next Iraq War. And
Right.
and that's where I'm at.
It's so funny. It's like oftentimes when we talk about 9/11, we talk about the Patriot Act, we talk about terrorism in any kind of way. Healing doesn't seem to be the centering
Right.
focus of a lot of that conversation. And what I'm feeling like the thread behind a lot of what your pull has been is how can we actually create a space where we can become more human together on the other side of something that feels so inhuman, so many of these experiences. So it's, I mean, yeah, that there was so much of my body that was like, yeah, what he said, yeah, all the way through. So, I feel like there are so many ways that this could go, but obviously the name of this podcast is Checkbox Other.
Mhm.
And so the question that I ask all of our guests is, what is a time in your life, and you're more than welcome to bring more than one to the table if you'd like, or you have felt other or different or as though you don't belong? And how is that? Again, I feel like there were a couple that you kind of touched on a little bit, but is there any moment in your life that stands out in the face of this question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna offer a disclaimer first, and then I promise I'll faithfully answer your question. But so let me start off by saying, I, kind of grew up with a lot of privilege. A lot of people grew up with more privilege, but I grew up with a lot. And I'm a straight white man from Central Connecticut, and so the odds are in 99.999% of scenarios that I'm not gonna feel other, and I do feel fairly significant sort of gratitude for that. That's not to say I've never struggled with identity or, place in the world. I'd say a lot of my life is a struggle for finding place in the world. And I currently, get frustrated by certain demographic issues, like when we were planning our wedding, people would talk to my wife as if she was the wedding planner. Now that we're new parents, people, daycare people can't wait to talk to my wife and make eye contact with her. And I'm just like, no, I'm an equal partner here. You should talk to me. And then of course, but I'm immediately reminded then, she has to deal with that in every other 99% of scenarios. Right.
Right.
So it's a frustration. And I would also say it's not a fun time to be a public servant in America. It's sort of a direct career direction that's been a bit demonized, and we live in an era of conspiracy theories. And so it's like you get out of DC and people, I don't care if you're a chef in DC, people hear you're from DC and they just can't wait to shout a conspiracy theory at you. I'd say those things are frustrating to me from an identity perspective, but they're not kind of oppressive or don't sort of cause me to feel like I don't belong in American society, or even really any particular subcategory that I've been a part of. And I just want to recognize that I really have won the demographic lottery. And I think a lot of that pushed me toward wanting to go into service and feeling like I want to give back. But, even now I work at a Jewish organization and I'm not Jewish, and no one makes me feel bad about it. I've just been so lucky. But at that same respect, I work for a Jewish organization at a time with really high anti-Semitism rates. And so, I want to help people who don't have that kind of privilege, and sort of seek out some of the biggest challenges, because I recognize that I kind of feel like I have that luck. But no, certainly, like anyone else, I've certainly struggled with identity, and we talked about some of it. What do I want my place in the world to be? I'm not the first public servant in my family, but I'm one of very, very few. And it's been an interesting ride to kind of break free from kind of a lot of patterns and habits in family, and then to go this route that is, like I said, subject to many a conspiracy theory, has been a little odd, but none of frustrating as it might be. Again, it's almost always also a reminder of my luck.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like there is this part of when we talk about being other or feeling different, that we have to kind of grapple with the part of privilege and the part of where we can take up space and we can feel like we belong. I mean, they're along the spectrum for a purpose and a reason, and there's a reason that question is asked a lot of times, because I do think we kind of grapple with our own pulls across our identity buckets, and how those, even from when we were younger to now, how you step into your identity differently now than you would have been. And even
Right.
more so, I feel like, God, this was an episode, probably one of the first 10 episodes we had. And I was speaking to Carla, and she was talking about her son, who's a straight white man in Central Connecticut as well. And he's also Mexican, but you can't visually tell that. And you can't tell that by his name. And he was having such a hard time with the fact that, I mean, he was in high school, feeling like he was being vilified for his identity buckets in society right now, which again, when we were younger, we didn't talk about those things. We were colorblind when we were younger. So just all of the dynamics of the fact that this is a very fluid experience within structures that have upheld very specific identity buckets with privilege, that we're all kind of going between understanding our own internal identity and our collective identity at the same time is such an interesting part of how we can evolve as humans. But then also, I think how you leverage that privilege and power that you have to create a world that you want to see is the part that's like, that's the non-luck part of it. That's the decision making and the autonomous and the free will dynamic that we like to beat our chests about as Americans, that we have freedom to do these kinds of things, to be able to step into spaces and to use that power and privileges. And I think is probably the the most, I don't know, a reflection so much of kind of what's in the inside that you can't see, no matter what you look for on the outside. So well, I appreciate you talking about that. I think there are a whole bunch of ways that each of us kind of goes through that. So I appreciate, I'm like, I try not to giggle in the front end, but yeah, I think when you're walking into a space and you're like, I'm excited about this wedding, why aren't you looking at me? I think that that's a very real thing, that there are so many of us that we walk into a space and we're like, do you not see me? Am I not here? That is such a universal experience in some way, shape, or form, that we're like, why am I not allowed to take up the space right now? And can I say something about it, or do I need to be quiet? And is there a space for me to get smaller? Okay. One of the biggest things that, as I was preparing for this and thinking about having a conversation with you, was about this dynamic of taking what was, when we were younger, the conversation around terrorism was something that was like, okay, we know how to think about this. We've been taught through media, through movies, through all different kinds of things of how to kind of think about it in a very binary perspective, good, bad. And then to take all of those learnings and apply them to every single day of what you're putting all of your energy and effort towards. How did that have you kind of thinking about your place in this world, your place in society? But then when you, I don't know if switched is the word, but when the lens shifted to be internal within America, looking at white supremacy and having white supremacy upholding a lot of these levers of privilege you talked about, how did that kind of help? How did that play with your own journey yourself?
Yeah, no, interesting question. And I think, Carla's son, as you worded it, I think he and I, sounds like we have similar ways of thinking about identity, which is to say, just because you have a privileged identity doesn't mean you've never experienced adversity, but you sometimes don't feel like you can talk about it. And so it's just lovely to have an opportunity to talk about those dynamics. And I think there are a lot of people who would sort of say, when you're talking about domestic terrorism, there are people who would say, sometimes wrongly, that there are a lot of people who are attracted to these movements because they feel unheard. And so finding the language of people to feel heard and be able to talk about, just because I'm white doesn't mean I don't have any problems, I think is a great sort of way of thinking about it. And I would say, as I've kind of evolved my thinking, when I was dealing with counter ISIS stuff, it was really about, what does it take to be sort of a human who feels a grievance, who feels like their, like you said, collective identity is under threat, and seeks to sort of join a violent movement. That grievance that they perceive can be real or perceived. It can be really, no one's listening to me, no one's looking out for me, or it can be, people are looking out for me. I just, for whatever reason, I saw on social media that someone else got more lucky than I did, and so now I'm angry. And I felt like that was a kind of missing piece of the puzzle, in that there were some academics who were talking about that human angle, that identity angle, the feeling of otherness that drew people into the movements. It's kind of like recruiting into a gang to join those movements. And I was parallel to watching these people who were joining these movements because they felt otherized in their communities. I felt for, one of the first times in my life, like I really got praise from a lot of different people. To your point, there's a lot of people who were like, oh, you work in counterterrorism? Let me buy you a beer. And I, frankly, a lot of people who, when I previously had said, I work in politics or whatever, before that, I worked on Capitol Hill, first job after college. And people would sort of say, like, oh, you're one of those. Right. And so it was just so interesting to kind of feel empowered and like I belonged at the same time that I was watching a lack of belonging take down a society, in that case overseas. And I was also really frustrated that we couldn't look at it through that kind of dynamic lens of what's the human angle of this, the sort of Jack Bauerification of counterterrorism. And, the show 24, which I guess, will date me, but a little bit, but, it's this guy running around, frankly, mostly torturing people. And, people who work in this industry know that torture doesn't really work. And he's working for a sort of entity that is based on the National Counterterrorism Center. It's like, if you've been to the National Counterterrorism Center, it's mostly nerds in front of computers. No one's out running around torturing people, right? And so we see this kind of fetishization of countering terrorism. And, I felt like I was clamoring for people to recognize that this is a whole of society kind of community dynamic that we need to solve to prevent the next generation of people deciding to go join these movements. And everyone, frankly, it was kind of easier for me to, again, get a free beer or whatever, because people thought I was Jack Bauer. And I was like, first of all, if you knew me from middle school, like Nikki, I am no Jack Bauer. But it's just, it is, interesting. Like you said, a lot of people wanted to be focused on countering ISIS. I, fortunately, for my own identity, had sort of aligned with more the progressive side of the kind of political spectrum. And so frankly, I felt a little bit of critique from my own people who I self-identified with, that I was kind of going after, to put it in some people's terms, I was going after brown people. And I wouldn't characterize it like this. There was a lot of violence and tragedy that was perpetrated by these movements, but in rightly dealing with that tragedy, that's kind of conflated with a lot of the wrong things that were done in terms of discriminatory, airport screening and all the other, issues that have impacted Muslim Americans. And so then to your point, when I switched back, when I switched to focus domestically, there were a lot of people within my sort of cohort of progressives in national security who were sort of like, thank God, now you'll get the kind of real bad guys. And I was sort of like, I was going after real bad guys before too. But now, fortunately for me, the data has shown that it's a far more lethal threat. And so using that data has helped me kind of, both champion my own cause, while also assuaging some fears from the demographic that would have bought me a beer because I was working in counterterrorists and going to get ISIS is now like, what do you mean you're coming after our own people?
Yeah.
But again, my sort of direction, my feeling is that, there's, we're not going after anyone. We're trying to heal, like you said, heal communities, and trying to figure out kind of why is there a group called American Identity Movement that people say, hey, that's got American and identity in the title. That's how I identify. Why is that the community you seek out? I think is something I've tried to take with me from both previous, life countering ISIS to now. But yeah, I would say the target demographic that wants to buy me a drink has definitely shifted over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful to have the people who sort of welcomed that I'm sort of going this direction myself. And then, like I said, grateful to have the data on my side to say, I'm not doing this for political reasons. I'm doing it because that's where the sort of challenge and that's where the violence is coming from.
Yeah, for sure. And if anything, unfortunately, there have been a series of more high profile experiences of that showing up in a pervasive nature. So it's not just we need Jack Bauer and the news coverage of the past to then be minimized. It's that in the present, our news coverage, while it still is skewed from a color perspective, for sure, we're definitely at least getting the microphone in the hands of folks that are talking about what's happening on our soil and is happening with regard to white supremacy, for sure. So Um, yeah, it's so funny as you were talking about the name and the label that people are giving these groups, that people are kind of coming together and banding together underneath. I've always found it really fascinating how we can use language
Mhm.
in such a way that we put something like American identity out there, and you're like, yeah, I'm American, yeah, I'm proud of my
Right.
identity, and you're like, get in there, and you're like, oh wait, I'm not exactly sure what you're using the buzzwords, but you're using them to mean something very different what those buzzwords mean for me. And so just kind of demystifying so much of that, I mean, as a relative layperson in this space, it is something that I think when people are feeling isolated, like the last 2 years specifically, but for many
Mhm.
years before that, that you can get really drawn in by language, and you can meaning make language to be something, and then you end up getting stuck behind, like you were talking about, you get kind of initiated into a gang and you're like, wait, how did I get here?
Right.
I did want to connect with people, I wanted a community, but in order for me to stay here, does this align with my values? Is this level of extremism something that I'm comfortable with? And if I say no, then I lose this connection that I was so thirsty for in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a great group called Life After Hate that's basically former white supremacists who sort of find the people who no longer identify with the direction it's gone and help them disengage from those communities. That type of work is, incredibly important, and is how we're going to sort of take these entities apart. But yeah, to your point about labels, they're never going to call it come join the fascist oppressive movement. No one's going to say that, right? And so there's all this marketing, and then that marketing gives kind of plausible deniability. Oh, they just care about their heritage, they just care about their community's history. And it becomes harder for people like us to sort of point out that those are just a thin veil for something pretty nefarious. And also, to your point, we're seeing things, we're stuck at home, we're seeing things on social media, and things are, the information coming to us is moving faster than our human brains were set up to, accommodate new information. And so, we kind of, and also platforms are set up to channel us towards the things that are going to make us the most angry, right? So we're
Yeah.
sitting in our homes, and, white supremacist propaganda has spiked over the last couple of years. And a lot of the online propaganda, when coronavirus was spiking, as were conspiracies about George Soros, creating the virus as part of a Jewish conspiracy, right? And people are seeing this in their doom scrolling their own version
Right.
of, a grievance that they're sort of scared about. And now there's no outlet for them, or it's harder for them to have an outlet to see other people and to see people who are not like them. And so they're stuck, in this kind of path that's been set up for them by some, some social media platform.
Yeah, and it's within, it's between pictures of people's kids and things that are
Right.
genuinely really happening to their connections. So
Right.
our brain is not always the best at being able to separate those two things. And I think,
Right.
fascinating that the fascinating. There's a little bit that's like, kind of knew this was happening, but thanks for the data of all the stuff that's come out around the whistleblower at Facebook, when she was talking about how it was so very I guess in concrete terms expressed that fear and division are the way to stay on the platform, are the way to have people really engage with that platform. And so the fact that, like, as we're talking about healing and connection and community, when we're getting pushed information that has us actually creating that community but around fear and division, and extremism, is like, it's counterintuitive for the way that we are programmed as human beings. Okay, so, oh my God, I have so many. So one of the things that I'm gonna stay back on the questions. I have, like, we'll come
Sure.
back to
No,
it.
whatever. Yeah.
So, all right, one of the things that I feel like happens, so we talked about language, and especially language with regard to, attracting and marketing language for sure. When we talk about white supremacy, I feel like you and I didn't grow up with people, we didn't really talk about it. I mean, we might have learned about the
Right.
KKK a little bit, but Martin Luther King solved that, right? Civil rights movement
Right.
solved all that. So how do you, if like somebody coming to the table, I mean, like, I really don't I'm white, right? So I don't know what that means. Does that mean because I'm white, I'm a white supremacist? How does that, how do you kind of define white supremacy or think about white supremacy differently if you were going to kind of talk about the pervasiveness of it, the threat of it, and really just its
Mhm.
existence as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me differentiate between violent white supremacy and systemic white supremacy. Systemic white supremacy is where we've sort of oriented our laws, whether they're related to drugs or housing or any number of other seemingly innocuous areas, where we've oriented them in a way that the impact, not the language that we use, but the impact of them perpetuates a kind of white dominant society. Separately from that, there are people who actually think that that's a good thing. They don't deny that that impact is happening. They think it's a good thing, and we should be explicit. We should explicitly sort of oppress people who are non-white. And so and then they seek to kind of see that that comes to fruition through violence. And so those are kind of different concepts. And systemic white supremacy is just an incredibly big issue that I'm not going to be able to solve here today or at all. But what I would offer is, I think it's a question of language and figuring out how to think through the nuance as you outlined it. Just, we should be able to talk honestly about history and honestly about the fact that it's not solved. We didn't press a button and solve it. We just kind of came up with new names for some of the same concepts.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to identify that, but also, identify it without people feeling then that they are otherized. To your point, if you're saying, I'm guilt by association because I'm white, people are less likely to engage. So as you well know, there's the concept of otherness, right? So are you in my in group or are you my out group? If you are a woman of color telling a white man that someone who looks like me did something wrong, and then my kind of fight or flight collective identity reaction snaps into place, and I'm going to stop listening to what you're saying. And in fact, I might actually get worse. I'm going to go back and I'm going to seek out the opportunity to prove that I was right by looking up whatever manipulated data I can find on, Tucker Carlson or whatever, to prove my point that you're wrong, that I'm not part of the problem, you're part of the problem, right? Yeah. And I think part of this is being able to sort of have honest conversations about the many, many things we need to do to kind of dismantle those legacy structures of systemic white supremacy that we're not going to be able to budge a lot of them unless we can convince target demographics that are not already inclined to believe that that's a problem, to convince them that it is a problem and we should do something about it. On the kind of violent white supremacy side, they use the language, white supremacist movements use the language that I just described, saying, oh, these people, right, whoever the other is of the day, immigrants or the Black community or what have you, are trying to make these changes, not because we are a racist society, but because they're trying to take something that's yours. And that feeling of kind of grievance and threat, whatever that threat might be, again, it's a collective identity and it's a comparative thing. So it's not like you don't earn a lot of money or you don't have a safe streets. It's the fear that someone might take your safe streets away, or your friend who looks like you might be struggling to have a job, and they, whoever they are, this kind of aggrieved community is going to kind of come and take it from you. And that fear, our brains were created to scan the savannah for threats while we're hunting and gathering, and we see out of the corner of our eye something that looks like us because it's a member of our tribe, and so we go back to hunting and gathering. And sometimes we see something that looks like a lion, and so we just say, oh, that looks like not me, and so I'm going to fight or flight, I'm going to run or fight, and I'm no longer using the reasoning part of my brain. I'm now using the kind of Daniel Kahneman thinking fast and slow sense. I'm using the sort of anger part of my brain that can do big things strong without pausing to think things through. And that kind of fear and lack of reason is something that is used, purposefully by these movements to create fear. People who are fearful enough to take action, violent action, because they feel so kind of afraid of either for themselves or their communities. And again, sometimes those grievances are real. Sometimes grievances are real. Sometimes grievances are perceived. And in the case of critical race theory and all these other things, obviously these are boogeymen. These are perceived grievances that are not real, and yet people have been convinced that they are under genuine threat. And so to come back to your question, kind of how do we think about this and how do we talk about it? I think the first step is to have kind of an open, honest conversation. The second step is to recognize the need for the right messenger and the right kind of way to sort of talk about it in a way that's not shameful, in a way that's not only presented by an out group to another member of a different group, but instead to kind of break down those walls. And we look at it. We've done some projects in the online space. How do you undermine the propaganda, the online propaganda the white supremacist community advances? And so we partnered with this company called Moonshot, and they have this kind of partnership with Google that they're able to advertise against the same search terms that you might use to find white supremacist propaganda, right? So, the Turner Diaries, right, is a popular sort of manifesto to read, right? So if you're searching for the Turner Diaries PDF, that means that suggests you probably want to read it if you're trying to find a PDF, right? So they'll advertise against that. And the ad will say, they don't censor, the results that come up, but they'll add an advertisement that'll say, are you worried about, the safety of the white race? And they'll talk in the terms, they'll meet someone where they are, which is Google. And they'll talk in the terms that they'll use phrasing that's in the terms that these people are kind of understanding and are looking for. I'm under threat. It's the white race, my community, my heritage. Are you scared about your heritage? And you click on it. And you have to have someone, you channel that person to a source that is someone who kind of looks like them and talks like them, but also is not, ascribing to the ideology that they were unfortunately looking for. And so that means, kind of trusting people who, might not look like me or talk like me, and but might, in fact, they probably shouldn't, right? If I were to if I were to go to the local neo-Nazi meetup, I don't think that I would be met with excitement, right? So you have to have someone who kind of looks and talks in the kind of language that someone is willing to hear and feels like they're part of their in-group, and then undermines that propaganda in kind of language that they would use. I'm also angry about preserving heritage, but then kind of list out the talking points that you and I might agree with, but again in terms that someone else understands. And so I think it's a lot about language. It's a lot about honesty. And bringing people together who, you might not typically kind of want to be in a room with, and vice versa. But that's a challenge. And the violent side is a much different challenge than the kind of systemic side. But both of them are part of a broader challenge that requires, honesty and dialogue.
Yeah, for sure. And it's, the word that keeps like popping in my brain the whole time, I'm on like the H train. I brought healing first, and it's humanizing the experience.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so much of this that it's funny. When I was first starting to do work in the DEI space, and learning from different people or seeing what was out there and getting an understanding of how people, the marketer in me, how are you putting the word out? How are you trying to attract people? How are you communicating this, especially a topic that we have been taught for generations that we don't talk about? Like I grew up split between two worlds in that kind of sense of like being Black and being white, but also not being able to talk about either or the middle. And so, okay, how and what are people talking about when they're bringing this conversation to the forefront? And so much of it was around shame, and so much of it was around fear, and so much of it was about jockeying for position and being right or wrong. And again, it was this threat. It was this violent kind of war dynamic to the way that the conversation was had on the front lines, even especially as like the first entry point. And I always find it so interesting because when I go into spaces and people are, especially last summer, doing kind of workshops with folks about racism in America, and it being something that like we're acknowledging it's real right now, and there were so many people saying, well, I'm white and I don't know what to do with that. And if you're being met with, well, yeah, white people this, white people that, white people this, like who can hear in any kind of way? If anybody, if you forgot to put the dish in the dishwasher and somebody came to you and tried to solve that problem that way, you wouldn't hear it. And so it's really fascinating how we have witnessed so very much. And I think 24 was such a perfect, it made me like laugh. It brought me back to college, but was such a perfect example of just the punch you in the face to handle problems instead of
Right.
actually treating you like a human being and trying to figure out what you need, what I need, what's happening here. Hit first, deal with that later if we ever deal with it. And so, yeah, I do think there is a part of this that we haven't been really taught to live in the gray area of it all. We've either been taught of like what it is to fight or what it is to surrender, and what is it to like exist in the in between and actually allow for the discomfort of not knowing something or not being like somebody, to be not the lion, but just to be a little bit of discomfort for you to understand somebody else might have a different perspective or might not necessarily know what to say, but feels like they have to performatively be certain because they're not really sure, but they don't want to look weak. So it is really interesting to think about like, what would the table look like? What would the arena look like if we allowed people to come in and not have everything all set and not have everything perfect and not be beating their chests as they walk in? How can we create a space where we can be human together?
Absolutely. And starting off with a disclaimer, if you believe any of these things and you've decided to be violent or commit a crime, you should not be met with dialogue. You should be met with, a law enforcement criminal justice process response.
Yeah.
So let me just be clear. Violent white supremacy, is a crime because it's violent.
Yeah.
From a perspective of how do we prevent someone from going down that path, or how do we address the systemic issue, to your point, the human brain does not want to experience shame. It's going to avoid experiencing shame. So if you're communicating something, like you said, you didn't load the dishwasher correctly, my brain is geared to work toward the 10 different ways, 10 different data points that suggest I loaded the dishwasher correctly. And you can imagine when the shame is based on, something you an immutable characteristic you can't control, like your race or gender. But the human brain is sort of aligned toward being sensitive, that you must be shaming me. And since you're shaming me, I'm going to resist it and kind of go the opposite direction. And so creating kind of an open environment where we talk about kind of history and kind of also, kind of retribution and sort of how do people sort of experience the way to come back and for society, forgiveness, right? And so if you have committed a sort of an offense, right, like anything else, right? So if you've perpetrated shoplifting, there's a certain set of things that you can do that society will largely forgive you. If you are, if you have said kind of racist things in the past, there's a lot of circles, let's say, in which you are never forgiven and never kind of able to sort of you are always kind of judged for that. And we're rightly judging people for being racist, but you have to give people an out, right? And so again, I'll bring back to this group Life After Hate. They basically say, come join us. Not only will we help you get out of this movement, this white supremacist movement, but come be part of the effort to dismantle them and be sort of a voice for hope rather than a voice for hate. And that sort of teamwork and that sort of feeling like, oh, I can not be forgiven as in people will forget that I, did some terrible thing,
Right.
but I can, sort of pay my debt to society in a way that I can kind of move on in terms of at least my identity, and can I feel, forgiven enough to feel like I'm okay, because my brain doesn't want me to feel like I can't be forgiven. And
Right.
so if I can't, then I'm stuck, right? And so giving them that opportunity to feel that openly and honestly is a big part of it.
And, I think the way that you disclaimed it up front made me think about, just kind of an opportunity. I'll say that. I use the word opportunity and interesting a lot to mean a lot of things. But I think there's an opportunity for us as a culture specifically to get get exposure to more of an experience with accountability, and that accountability doesn't mean cancel culture fully.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily, and I don't use cancel culture in the way that it means you made somebody's feelings hurt at some point.
Right.
I think there is space for us to learn how to do something wrong and not be wrong. It's kind of Brene Brown's whole thing of like, I made a mistake. It doesn't mean that I am a mistake.
Right.
That we create more space to be able to understand that when I make a mistake, I do have to be accountable for the impact of what I did. And even if my intent was different, doesn't necessarily matter. I always talk about it as like, if you're flailing your arms around and you knock someone in the nose and break their nose because you didn't mean it, doesn't mean their nose isn't broken, right? But
Right.
we have
Right.
to deal with the fact that like, okay, maybe the accountability of it is acknowledging that it happened, apologizing, and dealing with kind of the assault of which it happened one way or another, but also realizing I can't continue to operate with my arms flailing around because there are other people here. And so often we go from, I didn't mean to do that. It was your fault that you came anywhere close to me. I can take as much space as I want to. Your nose should be bleeding. Your nose should be stronger than that.
Right.
All of that kind of reactive and I always think of it as like very scarcity focused. Like, I need to fight you or else I'm not going to have it, rather than being like, oh my goodness, if my nose was hit like that, that would be terrible. And so creating space for us to be able to actually honor and acknowledge when something is, if somebody does do something racist or their beliefs are racist, but they might not have known or they did know, but realizing that like, okay, this wasn't okay. I shouldn't keep doing this, but also I need some time and some space to actually unlearn that behavior, to understand where it came from. I need that ability to have like that incubator of sorts that allows me to evolve, because we as human beings, again, we're talking about all the kind of animalistic parts of our brains that are doing so many different things of like being in the savannah and being afraid of threats, but we are many, many years from that. And we have really, really adaptive brains. That's what makes us so, our brains so powerful, that
Yeah.
like we have the ability to adjust and we have the ability to understand how we can evolve moving forward, but without the accountability of it, without holding space for saying that's not okay, this is what's wrong with it, and here's a path forward, it's really difficult for us to just assume that we're going to all of a sudden get it in shame, in punishment, in harming another person, that we're all of a sudden going to understand a path that we've never really experienced before. So I do think, as you're talking about life after hate, that was the
Yep.
name of it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Correct. Yep.
I remember watching specials and I'm like, Nikki, get the words right. It is something that I think I'm so happy that that organization exists. I just, there's a part of me that's like, can we all create little places in our lives where those experiences are allowed to happen, whether it be about race or any other kind of harm that you're inflicting or any other kind of assault of sorts that you created. How can you create a space where you actually learn how to handle when you've harmed somebody and move forward and create a connection as a human being to make sure that that person's okay and evolve, so you're not doing that in the future? Don't feel like we have that many opportunities. I always think about how, like, playing sports growing up, you learned how to lose. There are so many
Yeah.
people, I feel like, in this world right now that, like, I know they played sports, but when did you forget how to lose? When did you forget that, like, there are times when you might not get what you want? That doesn't mean that you need to go and like tear up the field. It just
Right.
means that like you have an opportunity to do things differently. You have an opportunity to see where you might be able to improve. And so often we haven't been able to, because of, I think, so many of the messages that we're given, that if we stumble, if we fall, if we're not perfect, if we don't get our participation trophy, then there is reason for rebellion. There is reason for
Yeah.
anger. There is real reason for kind of that violent streak that we tend to go, that kind of animalistic way of going backwards, rather than being like, wait, I know how to handle this. I'm okay. I am not under a threat to my life because I lost that game, or because I lost
Right.
that thing, or because I accidentally harmed someone, or because I said something that's been said in my family for so many years and it harmed someone and I had no idea. Does it mean that your life is over? It means that there's an opportunity for you to figure out, okay, I didn't know something. How can I actually learn now? And oftentimes as adults, we're not encouraged to learn. We're like, okay,
Right.
school's over after college or maybe after your grad degrees, and then you should just know everything, and then you need to teach it to the next generations. But what if we gave ourselves room to actually be curious and learn?
And the sort of pride that, if I worked really hard to do the thing that I do professionally, therefore I must understand this other thing. And sort of the pride that you need to, the humility that you need to sort of express to be open to that in the first place.
Yeah.
And then also, let me say, you mentioned, marketing previously and kind of your background in marketing. And, I think about that a lot in the concept of market segmentation. And, you don't market your product the same way to a 65-year-old woman as a 6-year-old boy, of course. And I think of it as like there's an accountability market segmentation where I look at sort of the January 6th insurrectionists, and they need to be held accountable on a very high level because the threat was severe. They are adults. To your point, feeling like they didn't win, and that's excuse for a coup is not an acceptable. We have to show to the world that that's not an acceptable way to deal with your grievance. Again,
Right.
grievances come up in any number of ways. Sometimes they're real, but in that case, it was a perceived grievance. It wasn't a real grievance, and you can't commit violence and try to overtake the government. We have to sort of set that example from the top. The flip side is, a 6-year-old who is in a classroom and doesn't understand why what they just said is wrong shouldn't be dealt with, again, kind of in the same sort of shame driven, criminal justice driven way that a January 6th insurrectionist would. And we need the ability to kind of segment that, because when your 6-year-old is met with, don't be part of the white supremacist movement, like they don't understand that, and they've definitely got some uncle who's going to defend them in a way that's probably set some bad boundaries. And so we have to make sure that we can find our language to kind of talk about these things differently and handle them differently. One is as sort of open and shame-free dialogue, and the other as the way that society achieves accountability when someone's committed a crime, which is a trial and a criminal justice form of accountability.
Yeah, and I think so much of that too is the ability to witness. So not having to wait till everybody is at that point of accountability, but be able to bear witness to the fact. I feel like so much, I'm thinking of that 6-year-old, right? You see in school, if someone bites someone else, you don't have to necessarily be the person that's biting them, but you see, okay, we're not supposed to bite. And this is what happens when we do that.
Right.
If we're right now, I think we're set up in such a way that so often, especially along racial lines for sure, that there is a lot more exposure to certain demographic groups being law enforcement being inflicted upon, or actual punishment happening. Whereas we see in so many ways, like how did that end up? We don't even know how the prosecution of all this went. How did that go? Right. Oh, this got I always think about when I went to school. I was abroad, but I remember my roommates calling me and being like, so there was a guy with a gun outside our door. And I was like, excuse me? And it was something that I never heard about, except for the fact that it happened to my roommates. And it had gotten under the rug and under the rug and under the rug because of where it was, because of all the privilege that it was steeped in where I was, that we never heard about that. But you will hear about a little kid picking up a gun somewhere else, and it will be the end of the world, and all those parents, anybody around there is not suitable to be around any other human being. But that's happening in a space where we have our own little cocoon where we can shove things under the rug. We don't actually see where accountability happens because we act like it never happened in the first place, but these things are happening. So it kind of gives you this little, like this feeling of a little bit of gaslighting of like, okay, my roommates were like, well, we know that happened. How did nothing happen from it? Okay, so I guess it was no big deal, even though in your brain, it was a big deal. You're like, well, if this is how it happens this time, next time, I guess it'll be handled the same way. And so just being able to witness when these kind of more extreme experiences are happening, that it is important for us as a collective to actually understand, how do we as our society and culture handle these things? It doesn't necessarily mean like, well, I don't know. There's like in different cultures, there's like the shame huts and the shame tents and like putting things on display in that kind of way. I don't know. Maybe that is part of what we need to have some element of, but the fact that we just act like it never happened is so mystifying, I think, for so many people, that it's like, wait, this was wrong. We know this was wrong. How is it that we're kind of being arrested is the worst thing that's happening right now for folks? Right. How can we create more of a window, I think, into what accountability really means and what it feels like within our society, rather than having people have to test it out to then experience it for the first time.
Right. And now we live in a society where, what happened to you in college, would be broadcast on Twitter and video, we'd have video evidence of it, but then we'd also have all these other videos on Twitter, and it might get lost in the shuffle. And so we have to talk about these things in a way that people know that a bad thing happened, and also that it is more important than the cat video you just scrolled by.
Right. Yeah.
And but also right, but then also frame it as it was bad, but also, people who might identify, for whatever reason with certain community aren't shamed by association.
Right.
But we need to kind of create that opening to talk about it honestly. And right now we have, the kind of internet in particular sort of framed around, encouraging the angriest, version of those responses, rather than the sort of trusted, open, and honest version
Yeah.
of the dialogue.
Yeah. And it's so funny because I always think about it like our outrage culture is a very palpable thing, but it is also so exhausting. And so often
Yeah.
I feel like we get the message that to be in the middle, to be in a space where you can be a human with each other is like so
Right.
much work. It's so uncomfortable, but there's so much energy and effort you're putting to be outraged all the time. Like you
Right.
are not able to, I mean, if you, there were so many, I remember it was on, I think NPR had a whole thing, a whole segment about like what outrage was actually doing to our bodies and the way that we
Yeah.
consume information and how we're just completely burning our attention span out because we are meeting everything with the same level of outrage. So that cat video, if for some reason you're
Right.
allergic to
Right.
cats, is being met with the
Right.
same level of outrage as January 6th. And
Right.
even more so, that might actually get more outrage depending on how it's positioned to you. It's like, it's fascinating for the part, we've been going, I feel like we've been bouncing between biology and so many different things, but the fact that our brains are not necessarily able to be nimble enough to be able to create a hierarchy in that way. And so much of it is how
Right.
messages are being given to us. And I will say this is one of the things I was going to say earlier, and I was like, no, go back to the questions. Uh, I always like cringe when I say this, but I'm fascinated by how brilliant the marketing of the white supremacist movement is. And I say movement, and I know a lot of this for you is the kind of violent dynamic of it all, but also the systemic part for me. I always am so fascinated about how the messaging and the consistency and the calls to action are nuanced and subtle and also overt and in your face, but have
Mm-hmm.
been able to last for generations. And so I've always been like, if we could figure out how that happens and not necessarily perpetuate fear and division and hate, but take that energy and use it towards kind of that healing dynamic we're talking about, where it's actually not about separating, but bringing together. If we had the ability to use that vehicle, it would be incredibly powerful because it is an extremely powerful engine that is showing up in so many different levels in so many different ways. Not everybody is brandishing arms and going out into the world, but we have all these different experiences on various levels that, the system is in place because we are all contributing in ways we might not even know.
Right. And you mentioned, the Facebook leaks earlier, and,
Yeah.
It's clear that Facebook and other companies understand that the thing that's going to get engagement, the things that's going to keep people on the platform so they look at more advertisements, is the anger version
Yeah.
of what you just outlined. And so we don't have the hope version. Should there be a kind of reorienting around, like emojis instead of anger face emojis, we could, like you said, use the kind of structures we've created for ourselves, platforms and whatever else, as engines for good. But right now there are people who are purposefully profiting off of them being oriented around being engines for anger.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to it's really hard to counter the fundamental business model of $1 trillion company on top of, like you said, trying to rewire human brains.
Yeah.
It's why it's, an incredibly, difficult challenge, and frankly will probably be a generational one.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about on the kind of the executive level of our country, how you have witnessed the shift of this stuff happening. I know that you were kind of in the room where it happens for a lot of these, for definitely for in the Obama presidency, you were in the room where it was happening for sure. And then I know I would love to hear your take on kind of how post January 6th things have been kind of being handled. So on the front end, when Obama became president and then was reelected, obviously, at least from my perspective, I think a lot of this conversation around white supremacy became much more pronounced because it became a whole lot less overt and a whole lot less veiled. And so I'd love to hear kind of from your perspective and kind of being in that space at that time, how that felt and if that made a significant shift in the work that you're doing now. And then how, as we have leadership that stepped in January of this year, how you feel like kind of the steps are being made or any kind of actions being taken towards more of that hopeful healing space, and also in the accountability realm. So that was there's a whole lot there, but hopefully you can
Yeah.
touch them all.
Yeah. And I think it's tough. There've been a couple different big sort of moments in the sort of domestic extremists, timeline, right? And I'd say, Bill Clinton being quote unquote the first Black president who, was thought of as kind of helping the Black community, was certainly, targeted, and then he used government as a tool, in many people's views, a tool of oppression, in terms of Waco and Ruby Ridge and those other tragedies that were kind of have been used in white supremacist and anti-government extremist lore. And really, we saw kind of an uptick in domestic extremists kind of in that era.
Mm-hmm.
And then to your point, a new uptick, a renewed uptick in when Obama was elected. And what I would say is, to your point, it became more overt. And you made a point before about, we used to talk about the KKK as a piece of history. And it's like, well, yeah, they don't wear white hoods. They wear collared shirts now. And so it's overt, but it looks normal. So it's been both made out in the open while also normalized simultaneously. And I think that trend sort of started with seeing a Black president as a representation of a new era that again made these people fearful wrongfully, and then the ability of even mainstream news outlets to sort of demonize a lot of the sort of agenda made it feel like he was accomplishing a lot that would, again, put these communities under threat. And so, yeah, we definitely saw not only a significant kind of uptick in the extremist threat throughout that period, kind of culminating toward the end of his presidency, but also a reticence on the behalf of policymakers to do anything about it. So there was a DHS memo written in 2009 that basically said, hey, domestic extremist groups are recruiting veterans to be part of their domestic extremist groups. And the Obama administration let DHS release this, and Rush Limbaugh and Fox News and others sort of basically took it apart and said, oh, you're accusing Republicans and veterans of being extremists, and you should be out there getting Al-Qaeda instead you're focused on us. And so then they, rescinded the memo, took back the memo, and it made it harder to sort of address these issues from a political perspective, which then meant they, and how I would characterize it is the Obama administration was really careful. And sometimes, you need to not be careful and just kind of step on the gas. So I think there were times where they could have done a little bit more to counter the rise of domestic extremism. But you go back to that memo and it's like, well, they almost, created a political atmosphere that would have undermined anything they tried to do. And instead they took a kind of minimalist approach that did, a little bit less than what was possible, but kept, below the political radar, which, I think there are a lot of people would think that that's the calculative move. And then we shift to the Trump administration when, you'd think people would feel less under threat, therefore there's no longer a Black president. And instead, what they received was a megaphone. And that the kind of conspiracies, and the sort of language and all the other things that were employed. And we looked at, online, anti-Semitism, for instance, and it spiked every time there was, a big, kind of President Trump related activity, including, his inauguration. And so it all kind of, it was the mainstream, it was the fringe internet for all coming together and saying, we have permission to say the quiet part out loud now. And there's something about kind of being part of the, a team you think is trending up or winning. And so that actually, as much as we started talking about how vile Trump and Trump's language was, and how much it matches white supremacist propaganda a lot of the time and that sort of thing. A lot of people said, oh, but he's also getting a lot of attention and, fighting for us, a lot of them would say. And so they actually kind of galvanized those groups, and they felt like they wouldn't be held accountable. And then in fact, they weren't. We saw the Trump administration dismantled the DHS intelligence team that produced the 2009 memo, and that was monitoring the domestic extremist threat. They dismantled the intel team. in the face of Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, other domestic extremist attacks, typically we would have had a kind of post 9/11 style or counter ISIS style, at least, galvanizing of government resources. And instead, they got rid of the prevention funding. They prevented life after hate from getting a grant that the Obama administration said that they wanted them to get. And so they kind of walked things back.
Yeah.
And then the Biden administration came in on the heels of January 6th with, President Biden said that a lot of his motivation for getting into the presidential race was seeing what happened in Charlottesville and wanting to heal the country. And then he came to office after January 6th. And so that's kind of an interesting bookend for kind of a lot of the framework through which people are seeing his actions on countering domestic terrorism. Are you staying faithful to that word? And I would say, they certainly could do more. I also have seen more action more quickly from the Biden administration than I've seen. I started my career during the late Bush administration, and then I served in government through the Obama administration. And actually, in the beginning of the Trump administration, I was still at DHS. I didn't last super long. So I've seen those different administrations, and I've never seen people move as fast as the Biden administration did to release significant brand new funding for states to better understand the violent white supremacist threat. They created an interagency strategy to address a national strategy to counter domestic terrorism. We've never had one of those before, and I'm not aware of us ever having a national security strategy, an official White House document that lists systemic racism as a national security threat. I'm not aware of that before. I think that's the first time. And so, I would say that they've done just so much to draw attention to the issue and the need to solve it. But then I would also just offer that, we're also waiting for the results of a lot of this, these announcements, right? So we have a national strategy, but, is there implementation guidance for how to put that into action? Is Congress going to actually put forth the funding for it? We just saw Congress in the reconciliation package provided more funding for organizations, nonprofit organizations, to secure themselves against these types of threats. That's good. It was also quite the budget fight. And so are there going to be resources to sort of reorient our approach? And what I'd say is the Biden administration's sort of signaled all the right directions, and it's been really welcomed. But then, of course, a lot of the propaganda and everything else is kind of baked in, and so a lot of people feel like he's fighting against domestic terrorism for political reasons, which the intelligence community, law enforcement community says that that's not the case, that there is a violent threat. And yet, everything is now political, right? I mean, I can't imagine a world in which we saw the rise of ISIS and people said, "Oh, Obama just wants to counter them because it'll change how people vote for him." Can you imagine being hobbled by trying to get money from Congress to do something and have them say that? So I don't envy the Biden White House, but I would say that they're signaling out of the right direction, and I think there's hope. But this is gonna be a generational challenge, and we need a whole of society approach. We need to address the social media component. We need to address dialogue in our schools, open dialogue in our schools, and open dialogue in our communities. But we also need more funding to law enforcement, more funding to federal, state, local efforts as well. So it needs to be whole of society. And anyone who thinks, there's a silver bullet that we're going to kind of press a button and all of a sudden we have put this one policy in place and then all of a sudden we've solved it. If you think that, my guess is there's something where, the verbiage has changed, but it's the exact same problem that's probably emerging, unbeknownst to you. And I'd be really concerned if we felt like we solved everything, in a year, or less. Right. And so this is going to be a, decade-long challenge that we have the ability to kind of use this critical kind of political window, right, that we are in right now to kind of jump on and hopefully, kind of jumpstart an effort to address the challenge and kind of motivate people to be kind of part of the change in their own communities and their own kind of how they talk about these issues, how they talk about how they use social media and everything else. Hopefully we can kind of galvanize a kind of hope over hate generation.
Okay. That was amazing. I have one last question because we went over a little bit. So I apologize to your wife. Tell her. One of the things that I feel like people ask me all the time is what can I do? So if somebody's
Mhm.
sitting here listening and that kind of hope over hate, for sure. I mean, I found myself being like, yes, Ryan, where do I set? Let's go. What do you need me to do? How do you, even whether it be in your life as an individual or people in your life that are close to you, how do you think about like what are the kind of small things that either you show up each and every day trying to achieve for yourself, or when people come to you, do you encourage people to do, though they're not necessarily on the front, they're not necessarily going to be on the front page of every newspaper or be in the situation or making decisions and being part of these conversations.
Right.
They are in the situation room of their lives and of their
Right.
families, dinner tables, and like their conversations with their friends. How do you think about like what we as individuals can do to help contribute to a world that is much more close to kind of that healing, humanized, and hopeful place we
Mhm.
talked about?
Yeah, and you're not in the White House Situation Room, but you're still a voter. So please do, take into consideration that these issues should be a priority. So I'll answer your question about communities too, but I would say that we all need to let our elected leaders and our business leaders know that this is something we care about. ADL has our 7-point plan for addressing domestic terrorism that we've made available on our website, our Protect Plan, for those who are interested. But within those 7 points, a lot are things that you can vote for. Some are things that you can do in your day-to-day life. And I'll list 2 of those. One is our Protect Plan. It's an acronym. I'm going to pull out the E, and the complicity of social media. And I would just say, be really conscious, think before you click, be really conscious of, what you're consuming and how it's making you feel. And I'll just give you a data point. If you look at the German Marshall Fund created an interesting dashboard of Russian propaganda, and everyone was like, "Oh, what are the Russians trying to convince us now?" And it's like you look at the dashboard, and it's like the most common topics are like hashtag Super Bowl, hashtag Trump, because they're talking about what we are talking about, and everyone needs to be conscious that the most popular Facebook social media posts might seem innocuous, but they might be also engineered to make you feel a certain way, and
Mm.
be really conscious of that to make sure that you're not, as the saying goes, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. So
Right.
make sure that you are not a product of anger, and lack of understanding and lack of sort of intellectual interest, but that you are someone who is, humble, curious, and can think with your rational side of your brain rather than your fight or flight side of your brain. And the second, one of the T's in Protect that I'll pull out is take domestic terrorism prevention measures, which is a policy request to fund organizations like Life After Hate that are a non-government approach. We don't want the government to go into communities and say, "What do you think about white supremacy?" What we want is for civic organizations to be able to have open and honest dialogue and conversations and disengage people from these movements. And within that kind of prevention model, a lot of the word community is mentioned over and over and over again. Another word that's mentioned over and over again is resilience. So how do
Mm.
we build resilient communities? And so what I would say is, if you're sitting at home and you are forward thinking enough to listen to this podcast, then I would say that you're probably a pretty self-aware person, and you probably have a sense that you understand that there's a pandemic of otherness. And so that also means that there needs to be kind of the public health counterpart to that. What does the kind of vaccination and public awareness sort of
Mhm.
spectrum look like for the pandemic of otherness? And so my kind of bumper sticker for you would be, build resilience in your own community. And that might be resilience to mental or behavioral health challenges. That might be resilience to, anger driving propaganda. And that might be resilience for kind of regulating one's own emotions. But whatever it might be, and there's a number of other types of resilience that people can think about, but make your community a resilient community. And that's the kind of change that, if replicated in every community in America, we would be having a totally different conversation right now. So I wish for the community resilience revolution, and hope that over the next generation, we can build more resilient communities to have these conversations and address the pandemic of otherness.
Well, I mean, bumper stickers all over the place. You can fill out the entire back bumper of a car with all these good things you just said. I am so grateful that you joined. I think there is a part of this that is like, if you are listening to this, you are here through all of the amazingness that Ryan just dropped all over this episode. You're welcome, first of all. And second of all, I really do think the part that you had said, Ryan, about like really having an understanding and a relationship with your emotions and your ability to understand how you're processing information is something that, yes, it's important in all the topics we talked about today, but it is important in so much of how we operate in this world and to be able to take up our own space. So if this particular topic makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable trying to do it, see if there's another way to do it and start and practice and allow yourself to. I always talk to my coaching clients about like picking up a 2-pound weight. It doesn't feel that heavy, but if you keep doing it, your muscles are able to pick up heavier and heavier weight. And so just start to allow yourself to just really question some of those things that are creating these triggers of either extreme emotion or extreme shutdown, so that when these opportunities come about where you may or may not be in a position of privilege, where there's something being said that is not okay, that isn't necessarily hitting you, that you have, the fortified belief of, I can stand up and speak out against stuff like this, or I can hold the space, or I can hold open some room for somebody that doesn't necessarily have space and room to talk about this. I can bring somebody so that their voice can matter and their vote can matter in a way that they've been obstructed to do that. So I am just so freaking grateful that you joined me today. I am like, I'm like teenage me right now is like, oh, hey, this is pretty cool. So I know for all of you listening, I'm saying thank you to Ryan, to you too, but I'm just so grateful that you joined us today. And I hope we can do something like this again soon, because this was fun.
Thank you. I mean, thank you so much for having me. Also, if you were catching what I was saying there, it's that conversations like this type of podcast, this is the type of change that, we need to create in our daily lives. So thank you for creating this opportunity. Thank you for creating this platform. And it was just lovely to see you.
Yes, right back at
to all
you.
the listeners, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
So, see, didn't I tell you? Ryan knows like all the things, and he is such a joy to be around. I hope that you learned something from this episode. I know that I did. I was nodding my head so much. You guys don't get to see that part. But I feel like Ryan dropped so much wonderful knowledge and made this whole topic something that is so much more relatable and so much less, I don't know, outrage filled and dramatic, even though these are very, very important dramatic things that are happening. So often they are positioned in such a way that we as human beings, as individuals, can't really process it without being completely and utterly overwhelmed. And I feel like the way that Ryan positioned so much of the conversation that we had today, it made it really tangible and it made it something that you can make a difference about. So I really encourage you, if you are somebody that has listened to this and said, okay, what can I do next? I encourage you to share this episode with people, to talk about it, to have a conversation over dinner around something that you learned in this episode. And especially if you are somebody that is white or is in predominantly white spaces, I encourage you to have more conversations about this stuff. Oftentimes people want to talk about it, but they don't necessarily know how to start. So this is my encouragement to spark that conversation. Use this podcast as a way to spark conversation with those that you care about, those that you want to have this conversation with, and those that you want to kind of change the world to be more hopeful, human, and healed. I can't wait to see you on the next episode, my friends. And thanks, Ryan.